What is the Renaissance? Does it make you think of paintings, statues, genius artists with the names of Ninja Turtles? It's a French term for rebirth, but rebirth of what exactly? Marco Polo and other merchants had something to do with it because when trade starts moving, money starts moving, and when the money starts moving, cities start growing, people start building things, people start competing with each other, and before long you have wealthy families and powerful cities saying, hey, maybe we should build a really impressive church or hire a really expert artist or make sure everybody knows how important we are. And that's not the whole Renaissance, obviously, but it's a big part of how we get there. The story of the Renaissance might start with Marco Polo and the Silk Road and how the Mongols, even though they were terrifying in a lot of ways, also created enough stability across a huge part of Eurasia that trade and travel became easier for a while. Not easy. I mean, you still have deserts and mountains and bandits and disease and a whole bunch of ways to die unpleasantly, but easier than it had been. And once those trade routes start opening up again, certain cities are in a really good position to benefit from that. That brings us to Italy. Let's dig in. Now, when we talk about Italy during the Renaissance, we have to be careful because Italy was not one united country yet. There was no modern country of Italy the way we think of it today. Instead, what we have are these powerful city-states. Cities that controlled their own territory, made their own deals, fought their own wars, competed with each other, and sometimes became incredibly rich. Some of the biggest and most important city-states were Venice, Genoa, Milan, and Florence. Those names might sound familiar because these cities all kind of became known for certain things. Venice is this powerful trading city built on islands and canals, and it becomes famous for trade and ships and glassmaking. Genoa is another major sea power competing with Venice for making money from Mediterranean trade. Milan becomes important for weapons and armor and textiles and luxury goods, and eventually we think of Milan as this fashion capital. Florence becomes tied to wool cloth, banking, art, learning, and eventually the Renaissance in a huge way. The reason these Italian cities matter is because they show us that Europe is changing. In the earlier Middle Ages, power was mostly about land. If you controlled land, you controlled farming. If you controlled farming, you controlled food. And if you controlled food, you controlled people. And that's where we get the word landlord. The lord had the land. So in the older feudal world, especially when Europe is dealing with all these raids and invasions from Vikings and Magyars and Muslim raiders in different areas, local lords became really important. Yes, there were kings and kingdoms, but a lot of the power is local. The lord has the castle. The lord has the knights. The lord has the land. And if things get dangerous, the people nearby are going to look to that lord for protection. But as we move toward the Renaissance, that starts changing. Land still matters, obviously. Food still matters. You can't eat a bank account and you can't feed your family with a painting. But trade and business are becoming more important than they had been. Cities are growing. Merchants are getting rich. Bankers are becoming powerful. And money starts moving in ways that don't depend only on who owns the biggest chunk of farmland. That's a huge shift. And if you think about where Italy is, it makes sense that these Italian cities would be right in the middle of this change. Italy sticks out into the Mediterranean like a boot about to kick the island of Sicily. And if all this stuff is moving between Europe and the Mediterranean and the Byzantine world, the Islamic world, and eventually farther east through trade, networks like the Silk Road, those Italian cities are in a pretty good spot. Goods could come in from the east. Merchants could move through ports like Venice and Genoa. Then those goods could be sold, traded, taxed, moved inland, and turned into something even more valuable. Valuable as in tons of money flowing through them. Because these cities were not just places where people bought and sold things other people made, they were also places where skilled workers made things. They had guilds, which were organizations of workers and craftspeople who controlled trading, quality, prices, and production. If you wanted to be taken seriously in a trade, you had to go through that system. You might start as an apprentice and then become a journeyman. And if you were good enough, maybe eventually become a master. We kind of do the same thing today with some trades. And if this is one of those things that students sometimes don't think about, because today we can walk into a store and buy a shirt for $10 or order something online and have it show up at the door like magic. But in the medieval and Renaissance world, cloth was a big deal. Clothing was expensive. Fine cloth was really expensive. And the ability to produce high quality cloth could make a city very wealthy. That's where Florence became especially important. Florence was not a major seaport like Venice or Genoa, but it became incredibly wealthy through cloth production, especially wool. Raw wool would come in and skilled workers would clean it, dye it, weave it, finish it, turn it into high quality cloth that could be sold for big money. Now, I know wool cloth doesn't sound very exciting, but at the time, textiles were big business. Wealthy people wanted luxury fabrics. Churches needed cloth. Armies needed material. Cities needed skilled labor. And if you controlled wool production and trade, you could build a fortune. And once a city starts building fortunes, the whole city starts to change, because now you need people who can handle money. Merchants need loans, businesses need credit, people need contracts. People need to move money from one city to another without carrying sacks of coins over mountains and through bandit-infested territory, which seems like a great way to have a very short and very unpleasant financial career. So banking becomes more important. And this is where you start to see another shift away from the old medieval system. Again, land is still important. Nobles still matter. Kings still matter. But now you have merchants and bankers becoming powerful too. And that is a different kind of power. It's not just, I own the land, so you work for me. It's more like, I control money, I control credit, I know who owes what, I know how to move wealth across long distances, I know how to finance trade, I know how to make money into more money, and that's a big deal. Honestly, it's not that hard for us to understand because we live in a world today that is just like that. Today, power is not only about land, it's about technology, finance, trade, communication, transportation, energy, and networks. If I ask my students today who some of the powerful people in the world are, they're probably not going to start with whoever owns the biggest wheat field. They're going to name people connected to technology or business or money. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, whoever happens to be in the news at the moment. Now, obviously, Renaissance Florence is not the same thing as the modern global economy. Cosimo de' Medici was not launching rockets or running social media. He would if he was alive today. But the basic idea is still useful. Power comes from systems, comes from trade and connections. And once people have that kind of wealth, they can start shaping the world around them. And that's what these Italian cities were doing. And this is why I think it's important to understand that the Renaissance is not just about art. We tend to jump straight to Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, the Mona Lisa, the Sistine Chapel, and all of that. And that stuff matters, obviously, it's incredible. But before you get the art, you need the money. Before you get the beautiful churches, somebody has to pay for them. Before you get the artists, somebody has to hire them. Same goes for libraries. Somebody has to collect the books. Scholars can only afford to translate ancient texts if somebody supports their work. In the Middle Ages, it was often the church. Monks in monasteries hand copying books like the Bible. But this is the Renaissance. By the Renaissance, money poured in large part from trade, cloth, banking, and wealthy city families. So the Renaissance grows out of this whole world of business and competition. And competition is a big part of the story. These cities competed with each other. Families competed with each other. Guilds competed. Patrons competed. Everybody wanted their city to look impressive. Everybody wanted their family name to be plastered everywhere. Everybody wanted to be connected to the beautiful church, or the brilliant artist, or the incredible building, or the scholar who had access to some ancient text that nobody had been reading much in Western Europe for centuries. And you can call that pride or ambition or civic spirit or showing off or all of the above. Human beings are complicated. If a wealthy family pays for a church, is that good for the community? Yeah. If they pay for a painting or a sculpture that people still admire hundreds of years later, is that a great contribution to culture? Sure. Are they also making sure everybody knows they're important? Also, yes. Both things can be true. And that is one of the reasons Renaissance Italy is so interesting. It's beautiful and messy at the same time. You have art and banking, churches and political rivalries, ancient learning and family pride, devotion, ambition, all that stuff all woven together. Now, one more thing that's happening here is that wealthy and educated people start looking backward. They start looking back at ancient Greece and Rome. Remember the good old days when the Greeks and the Romans built amazing buildings like the Parthenon and the Colosseum? Now we're mired in the Middle Ages. Can we go back in time? Can we please go back to the good old days? And that makes sense. Basically, Italy is sitting right there on top of Roman history. The ruins are around them. The old stories are around them. Latin is still the language of the church and scholars. People are rediscovering and studying ancient texts. They are thinking about Roman architecture, Greek sculpture, philosophy, history, literature, and government. And they start to think, maybe there was something about the ancient world that we can bring back. And that's why we call it the Renaissance, a rebirth. Not a complete copy of Greece and Rome, but a renewed interest in the classical world. And this is where money and ideas come together. Because if you're a scholar, you need support. If you're an artist, you need a patron. If you're an architect, somebody has to hire you. If you want to build something beautiful, somebody has to pay for the stone, the wood, the labor, design, the tools, all of that. And in cities like Florence, there were people who can do that. There are wealthy families who can fund those projects. And the most famous of those families is the Medici. The Medici are really where this whole story starts to focus, because they show us how a family can rise through banking and business, then use that wealth to gain political influence, support art and learning, shape a city, and eventually even get connected to the papacy and the Reformation. So if Marco Polo and the Silk Road show Europe looking outward again, and if Italian city-states show us trade and cities growing rich, the Medici show us what happens when that wealth gets turned into power, culture, art, architecture, and influence. And once the Medici enter the story, we are not just thinking about wool cloth anymore. We're talking about banking, about Florence, about Michelangelo and Leonardo and Botticelli. We're talking about popes and the intersection of spiritual power, political power, and money that will help lead to Martin Luther and the Reformation. Because history is not just one thing happening and then another thing happening in a neat little line. It's more like a web. And you pull on one thread and suddenly you realize it's connected to 10 other things. So the Renaissance didn't just materialize out of nowhere. It grew out of trade routes, city wealth, wool cloth, banking, competition, ancient books, ambitious families, and the desire to make something that would last. And that's where the Medici family comes in. But that's another story. This is Have to Know History. History you just have to know. Thanks for being here.